Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Isaac Stonefish. Isaac is the founder and CEO of the research firm Strategy Risk, which quantifies corporate exposure to China. He's the author of a new book called American Second: How Americans Elite Are Making China Stronger. Isaac, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Isaac, as I was looking into your background, I was surprised to discover that you speak fluent Chinese. I mean, it comes very handy when you are talking about China, and when you want to get really the insight of the cultural life in China and have see things from perhaps a different perspective than most North Americans. So I wonder if we could start by, yeah, at that point, how is it that you learn Chinese?
So I always wanted to learn different languages, and I spoke a little bit of Hebrew, really embarrassingly bad Spanish, and started taking Chinese in high school as I started going over there. And I did some self-study and then studied it throughout college. And it is fascinating how learning a different language and seeing the place through that language will change your perspective of it. And I feel like I'm a different person when I am speaking Chinese. And I think that's happens a lot to second language speakers.
And why Chinese in particular? I mean, it seems from my perspective that is the one of the most complicated languages there are. I mean, in level of difficulty, I don't know much about them, but I see Chinese, Japanese, and Arabic language. Maybe because they use a different what is it, letters, that I see it as so confusing. But in your case, why Chinese?
So the characters are so difficult. The amount of rote memorization needed was really a struggle. But the grammar in Chinese is often quite simple. So instead of saying I ate, you say I eat la, or I eat past tense. And instead of conjugating the verbs for the future or for different genders or for different numbers of people, the verbs basically never change. And so that parts of it does make it a lot easier. And Mao, when he took over, he created simplified Chinese as opposed to the traditional Chinese spoken or written in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and that makes the character memorization a lot simpler as well.
Okay, I have a question in regards to Chinese and maybe Japanese students. I went back. I'm going back to university right now. It's one
Mm.
of those COVID things, and I have noticed that Chinese and Japanese students somehow they have a study ethics that is beyond my understanding. I mean, I tell you, I give you an example. I take a French class, and the Chinese and Japanese students get better grades in that French class than the francophones that are there in order to get an easy grade.
Mm. Well, one of the fun things about being in China was seeing such a wide variety of people. And I think a lot of times the folks who will make it overseas are a very self-selecting group. And a lot of those coming to universities in Canada and the United States, do have really tremendous work ethic. But I was quite impressed by the diversity of folks there. It did remind me of the United States, just a very different vibes and very different people depending on the city, the neighborhood, even sometimes the individual classroom.
Right. And my neighbor right here next door, she from here from our building in Montreal, she teaches Chinese students how to speak English,
Hmm.
and she is surprised by how they're scheduled. These are little kids that are like 10, 11, 12 years old, and they are studying and doing work from the moment they wake up until they go to sleep. I mean, they have a more busy agenda than the CEO of any corporation right here.
That's a lot. I hope they're getting some time to play outside and read as well.
No, they don't. They don't. And this is one of the critiques, one of the complaints or problems that they are having. Those kids there that they are not living a life, the regular life of a little 10-year-old kid. But anyway, that's
Mm.
another story. Now, let me ask you, how is it that you became interested in Chinese language and culture to the present moment where you are this CEO of this research firm for strategy risk uh, uh, that quantify cultural exposure in corporate exposure in China?
So I got into it by spending time there. So the when I was 17, I spent a summer in Xinjiang, a region in northwest China. When I was 18, I spent a summer in Tibet, and I really wanted to be able to talk to people. I'm very extroverted. I enjoyed the conversations, but I wanted to be able to do them in Chinese, and so felt like learning the language was the best way to do that.
Okay, so in your business, so let's say I want to open a branch in China of, I don't know, my uh, designer business. I will go to you and ask you how could we make that possible?
So it's funny, in some ways, what we do is the opposite, which is you're a big multinational, you have 500 factories that you work with in China. Which ones pose higher risk because they're exposed to the region of Xinjiang, where the Chinese Communist Party is committing genocide against the local Uyghur people? In what ways are you working with the Chinese military or the Chinese security forces? So helping folks who are already there figure out careful, responsible ways to manage and reduce the risk that they already have.
I guess Elon Musk didn't ask for your services, no, because he just opened a shop in China in one of these critical regions.
He has. It was a pretty galling move, and doing it New Year's Eve too was pretty striking.
Can you just comment on the pros and cons of that move? Because I'm sure he did it for a reason.
So I always wonder, and it's sort of parlor game with folks who watch this, did he approve something like that? It's such a massive company, and how much does he manage or micromanage what exactly happens in China? What one certainly knows he's aware of it now, but I think what folks are understanding is the demands of the Chinese market and the demands of many Western markets and other markets around the world are starting to split. And doing something like that is a good move domestically because it can please certain Chinese customers. It shows the Communist Party that you're willing to work with them, but it can have real implications for a brand's PR reception in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Japan. And so, one doesn't understand also why New Year's, it's not that big of a holiday in China. It's a much bigger holiday in the United States, so it has a lot more symbolic import. And so I certainly think if they were going to do it, they could have done it in a less high profile fashion, but that's, that's the decision they made.
Okay. Just going off topic for just for 1 minute. So you quantify corporate exposure in China. I wonder if there is a counterpart of your business that quantifies exposure in Russia, and I wonder how they're feeling about their consulting business right now.
Well, they're probably just raking it in. I mean, it's such a time for that. So we were starting to quantify Russian exposure in China because there's a lot of worry among businesses, especially in the energy industry, but also in other industries as well, that the companies they're working with in China might be exposed to Russia, might be exposed to sanctioned Russian companies, and that might pose sanctions risks for these Western or European companies. So it is something that's really important to look at in China as well.
Okay, well, let's go into the topic of the book. How is it that you came about deciding to write this topic? And you title in suggest that American if America is first. Is America first?
I think economically, militarily, the United States does maintain its position of relative dominance. And the reason I chose such a title was I wanted folks to wake up to the idea that this might not continue. And it is very possible that China will become the world's most powerful country, the world's largest economy, in some measures that already is, the world's most powerful military, and wanted people to ask, is that something we're okay with? And if not, what are steps to take?
Okay, and when you talk about elites, are you talking about political elites or economical corporations? Who are you referring to?
I'm referring to former officials
Mm.
and business elites, and then also the world of Hollywood.
Well, okay, so that's interesting. So, can you tell us how the world of Hollywood is being influenced by China?
So Hollywood's a very striking example. Since 1997, when Hollywood studios released three films that contained elements that Beijing decided to find offensive, Hollywood studios have been learning with Beijing's help how to steer away from content that the party deems to find offensive. And it was a slow process. It was a long-term process, but starting from about 10 years ago, Hollywood studios have basically entirely stopped putting out any content that Beijing might deem offensive. And it's a very striking act of self-censorship, very striking in the US context and something that has a lot of implications beyond just Hollywood.
Okay, but if China is supposed to be one of these, I mean, one of the biggest market in the world, and Hollywood wants to sell films to China, isn't that a logical move? For example, if I want to sell a movie in Saudi Arabia, I'm not going to have woman in bikini walking around the beach because, of course, it's not going to be a big seller in Saudi Arabia. So isn't that Hollywood move something driven by how much money they want to make?
I think you make a good point with the Saudi example. The reason why a movie like that wouldn't play well in Saudi Arabia isn't because Saudi audiences wouldn't want to see that or can't handle that. It's the Saudi government that would have a problem with that. And the issue is not that Chinese audiences don't want to see realistic portrayals of China. They'd love to, and they can find that sometimes in Chinese movies. It's that Hollywood is too afraid of Chinese regulators, the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. I think the other piece is that corporations in the world we live in today aren't expected to be amoral actors. We want them to take a stand. We want them not to suppress voting rights in Georgia. We want them to stand up against the January 6th insurrection and some of the worst outreaches of the Trump administration. And when they criticize domestic politics in the United States, when they criticize Trump, but when they're so careful against criticizing China, they get a lot of well deserved flack for being hypocritical.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. How about corporations? I mean, for example, now Apple, who has their major manufacturers in China, if not all, I mean, they have to be very careful how they act in regards to China. Are there any other corporations that are so compromised as, let's say, Apple?
So Apple's a great example. We already talked about Tesla and some of the issues that they face. Boeing is one that's also long caught between what Beijing wants and what the United States wants. Boeing is a large, not only plane manufacturer, but also a military contractor to the United States
Mm.
government. And China is far and away its second most important market. And because Boeing sells in China exclusively to the government and government owned firms, the Chinese government has a lot of leverage over Boeing and over what it does. Walt Disney is another company that I address a lot in the book.
Yeah, tell us about Walt Disney and in regards to the Tibet movement.
Walt Disney is perhaps the world's most successful entertainment company, and they were the ones that learned the brunt of their lesson in the late 90s by releasing the film Kundun through a distributor that they were working with at the time. And Walt Disney decided that its best corporate strategy was to yield to Beijing and to listen to how Beijing wanted them to act. So, right after that movie came out in 1997, after they apologized to Beijing, they distributed a Chinese propaganda film. They started spending more time listening to how Chinese party officials wanted them to act and wanted them to steer their content. And they built large theme parks in Hong Kong, where it's a partnership with the Hong Kong government, and in Shanghai, where it's a partnership with real estate companies that are owned by the Shanghai government. And so Disney today is quite afraid of offending Beijing. And I think we saw that most egregiously with the film Mulan, which came out roughly a year ago, a little bit less than a year ago, where they thanked Chinese government organizations in Xinjiang, a region where these particular government organizations have been directly responsible for the crimes against humanity committed there.
I wonder if you could explain a little bit about the Chinese Communist parties and their actions to control technology companies such as Alibaba, or what is it, Tencent. I mean, Alibaba, was it they weren't going to go public, and then all of a sudden they were, I don't know, paused?
I'm glad you brought this up. So it was a subsidiary of Alibaba called Ant Group that Beijing moved against. And one of the things I tell my clients is that the greatest difficulty about doing business in China now doesn't come from the US government or from US consumers, but from the Chinese government and Chinese consumers. There's been a very strong leftist turn in the Chinese government under Xi Jinping, and especially over the last year or two. So we've seen that pushback against Alibaba. We've seen that against Didi, the ride sharing giant. We've seen that against Meituan, which is a food delivery giant. We've seen it even a little bit against Tencent, which has historically had quite good relationships with the party. And Beijing is redefining the social contract between Chinese businesses and the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. And that redefinition is making it more difficult for foreign businesses in China.
Wow. In your book, you also talk about other elites such as Henry Kissinger, and you call him a Chinese agent of Chinese influence. I mean, Henry Kissinger, what, he's 90 years old by now? Is he still?
Older than that.
Oh, really? So,
Yes, yes. I think he's about 98.
so how is he at this time on an age? How is he still an agent of Chinese influence?
Kissinger remains the most influential person in US China relations who's not an active government official. And I would argue has been the most influential person because of how long he's spanned the relationship. And what I think we all missed about Kissinger is that from 1982, the year that he founded Kissinger Associates, the consulting company that he runs, to the present, Kissinger has been a businessman first and a intellectual second. And in some ways, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, he runs a consulting business. It's very successful. I run a smaller consulting business. Consulting is okay. It's something that people are allowed to ethically do. I think the issue is the misrepresentation and the idea that Kissinger has spread that his thoughts, his feelings, his perceptions on China come from this austere, august, independent space, as opposed to understanding that they are heavily influenced by the business that he does.
Uh, wow, that's yeah. But isn't this kind of obvious? Like, if I mean, you are bringing it up in the book, but I mean, don't people know that he is talking out of both sides of his mouth?
I didn't.
Okay.
It was something that I learned much later, and I do hope that most of the other people who were following him were smarter about it than I was. But it was certainly something that was news to me.
Because this seems to be something that happens in almost every industry. For example, in the legal industry, a prosecutor for the state becomes an attorney, and then they use those connections in order to work out deals. And people from one industry go or in the financial sector as well. Goldman Sachs and the government it seems to have a revolving door. So I thought it was almost a standard for almost every industry there is.
It certainly is. It is a problem of U.S. corruption, and it's something that Kissinger has pioneered.
Okay, and okay, in regards to China and the influence on the United States, didn't we in the United States go through a similar cycle with what it was called at the moment Japan Inc. in the 80s and 90s? That people thought that Japan was going to buy the whole New York, or and that it had a overwhelming influence in politics and economics in the states, and somehow it petered out.
There are some similarities, and I think it's important to also mention the differences, which is Japan at the time was a healthy democracy
Hmm.
that had more overlaps with US national security and foreign policy interest than China does today. One thing I will say, though, is that period did lead to some horrific anti Asian violence, most pointedly in the early 80s when two out of work automakers murdered a Chinese American man because they thought he was Japanese and was stealing their jobs. And so I do very much worry about that kind of violence today. And I think it's something that we have to be very vigilant against.
Yeah, and even during COVID times, because we label the COVID-19 as the Chinese virus, I saw a video of a poor Chinese woman being beaten on the streets by
Yeah.
people just because I guess she looked Asian. I don't even know if she was Chinese or not.
Yeah. Yeah. It was pretty horrifying.
Okay, so in regards to academics, so there seems to be a overwhelming influence of China in the academic sector in the States, and here in Canada as well. I mean, their money is everywhere, and in Africa as well. So it's not in the United States only. I think their their influence is spreading everywhere. In my own country, Colombia, there are Chinese institutions in Peru, in Bolivia, everywhere seem to be. I think everywhere where there are natural resources, but yeah, can you tell us about the academic sector? How is it that the Chinese are influencing and people are self-censoring themselves?
The biggest worry is that some American academics and some academics from other countries are changing the way they speak and changing the way they think because they don't want to offend Chinese partner institutions. They don't want to lose access to Chinese archives or Chinese academics. They don't want to get a visa denied or not be able to go to China in the future. And I think it's a very real phenomena, and it's one that folks aren't really comfortable talking about. But I think it's a very important debate that needs to be had publicly in every country. How do we want to engage or not engage with China, and what kind of intellectual sacrifices are we willing to make?
And can you also, yes, one more topic that you bring up in the book is that television has been able to resist the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. How is that possible?
So television didn't have the same scarring that Hollywood had with the films that came out in 1997. Television didn't have a Disney that capitulated the way that Disney did. Television travels, generally speaking, a lot worse than films do. It's a lot more localized content. It's talk shows, it's reality TV, which tend to be less packaged for exports. And I think executives in television just acted more ethically than Hollywood executives have.
Wow. Okay. Well, I think you bring a lot of topics that make us reflect more in regards to the relationship with China. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing?
Thank you. The book is called America Second, and the book can be purchased at bookstores around the country as well as on Target and Amazon and Barnes and Noble online. And the work that I do can be found on my website, isaacstonefish.com, or my company website, strategyrisks.com.
Isaac, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed the chat.